On March 17, 2019, at precisely 6:42 a.m., in Riverside County, California, police records document a call that immediately unsettled dispatchers. Not because of panic, but because of its restraint. The caller Washi wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. At 6:42 a.m., a mother-in-law calmly called police and exposed a secret that would destroy everyone involved. Why was her son's wife hiding a relationship with a 20-year-old neighbor? And more chilling, why did the truth surface only after it was too late? What investigators uncovered inside that house still haunts this case. It's not a victim, nor a witness passing by, but a mother-in-law speaking with measured clarity about something she claimed could no longer remain hidden. What began as a routine welfare check would soon dismantle an entire family, expose a forbidden relationship built in secrecy, and set into motion a chain of events that ended in consequences no one involved could undo. March 17, 2019, 6:42 a.m., Riverside County, California. The emergency dispatcher noted the caller's voice first, not what she said. It was calm, measured, and disturbingly steady for that hour. The woman identified herself as the homeowner's mother and requested police presence immediately. She did not scream. She did not whisper. She spoke as if reading from a script already memorized. Officers Daniel Ruiz and Marissa Cole were dispatched within 3 minutes. They arrived to a single-story home tucked inside a quiet suburban block. Lights on, no movement visible. Nothing suggested urgency, yet everything felt wrong. The front door opened before they knocked. The woman who met them was in her early 60s, hair neatly pinned, robe perfectly tied. She introduced herself simply and stepped aside without hesitation. This was the mother-in-law. Inside, the house smelled of brewed coffee and something metallic underneath. The television murmured from another room, volume low. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no raised voices. At the dining table sat the second woman. She appeared younger, mid-30s, wrapped in a sweater despite the mild spring morning. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She did not look up when the officers entered. When asked her name, she answered softly, eyes fixed on the table. She was the wife of the caller's son. No injuries were visible, but her breathing was uneven. The mother-in-law remained standing, hands folded, watching every movement. She repeated only one sentence, calmly and consistently. Something inappropriate has been happening in this house. No explanation followed. No names were offered. The silence stretched long enough to become accusatory. Officer Cole noted the distance between the two women. They stood under the same roof but occupied different emotional worlds. As routine questions continued. Inconsistencies surfaced immediately. The timeline of the morning did not align. The wife's answers were delayed, fragmented, as if filtered through fear. The mother-in-law, however, showed no such hesitation. Her composure never wavered. She watched her daughter-in-law not with anger, but with resolve. Before any arrest, before any accusation, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. This call was not about an emergency in progress. It was about exposure. As officers prepared to separate the women for formal statements, the wife finally looked up. Her eyes were glassy, filled with something between shame and terror. Whatever had happened here was far from over. Outside, neighbors began to notice police cars and slowed their steps. Curtains shifted, curiosity quietly ignited. None of them knew that this morning would soon redefine the family behind that door. They also could not know how long the truth had been fermenting. The official report would later describe the scene as orderly. What it could not capture was the sense of impending collapse. This investigation did not begin with violence. It began with a choice to reveal a secret. As paperwork started and questions deepened, one unspoken fact lingered. Someone else was missing from the room. The explanation for that absence would shift everything investigators believed. And it would lead them beyond this marriage, beyond this house. By the end of the day, attention would turn outward, toward the quiet homes lining the street. One of those homes concealed a presence no one had officially named yet. And when that door was finally knocked on, the case would take its first irreversible turn. That knock would introduce a new figure, younger, closer, and far more dangerous than anyone expected. His connection to the wife would soon dominate every question. By mid-morning, March 17, 2019, investigators had begun the slow work that often defines the earliest phase of domestic cases. Observation. With no visible crime scene and no immediate charges, the focus shifted outward, away from the dining table and toward the world that surrounded the house. Officer Ruiz stepped onto the sidewalk as neighbors gathered at a cautious distance. People spoke quietly, as if volume itself might attract trouble. Most said the same thing first. The couple kept to themselves. They were polite, private, unremarkable. The marriage, from the outside, appeared intact. There were no loud arguments spilling into the street, no police visits before this morning, no public scenes. The husband traveled often for work, neighbors said, while his wife stayed home. She waved, smiled, attended community events rarely but without incident. Then the conversation always drifted to the older woman. The mother-in-law was described with careful words. Involved, protective, always present. She watched deliveries, noted visitors, asked questions that felt unnecessary. Some neighbors said she meant well. Others admitted her attention made them uncomfortable. She noticed everything, one neighbor recalled. Who came, who left, what time the lights went off. Investigators documented patterns. The mother-in-law lived with the couple for extended periods, especially when her son was away. She managed schedules, finances, routines. The household ran on predictability. Breakfast at the same hour. Curtains opened and closed with precision. From the outside, it looked orderly. Almost too orderly. The wife's role in this structure was quieter. Neighbors described her as kind but subdued, her presence shrinking over time. She stopped attending block gatherings. She rarely drove anywhere alone. When asked, she always said she was busy or tired. No one reported abuse. No one reported threats. What emerged instead was something less visible. Control wrapped in concern. Guidance framed as obligation. Inside the house, investigators noted similar patterns. Framed family photos emphasized tradition and unity. There were no personal items that belonged only to the wife. Everything appeared shared, curated, approved. Yet still, no crime presented itself. No bruises. No broken objects. No financial irregularities. Nothing that justified the weight of the morning call. Detective notes from that afternoon described a tension that could not be measured. The wife answered questions with excessive politeness, apologizing for pauses, for breathing too loudly, for existing in the room. The mother-in-law, by contrast, corrected small details unprompted. Times, dates, habits. Her tone was never cruel, only firm. She framed her involvement as responsibility. Someone had to keep order, she said. Someone had to pay attention. This dynamic had gone unnoticed for years. Friends saw a family functioning within tradition. Neighbors saw quiet compliance. Investigators now saw emotional pressure so normalized it escaped detection. Still, motive remained unclear. Why now? Why call police? Why escalate private tension into public exposure? As statements were compiled, one detail surfaced repeatedly. During the son's absences, another presence was occasionally mentioned. Someone young. Someone nearby. At first, the references were vague. A boy who helped with groceries. A neighbor who ran errands. A familiar figure passing by the house more often than coincidence allowed. No one suspected wrongdoing. Not then. But the repetition lodged itself into the record. By evening, investigators returned to the house with more questions than answers. The marriage appeared stable yet hollow. The control subtle yet pervasive. And somewhere within that carefully managed routine, a boundary had been crossed. The case had not yet revealed its center. But it was slowly drifting away from the marriage itself. Attention was beginning to shift toward the surrounding homes, toward the younger presence hovering at the edges of witness statements. By the next phase of questioning, detectives would stop asking how this marriage looked. They would start asking who else had been watching it from just across the street. By the third day of the investigation, detectives began hearing a name that did not appear in any initial reports. He lived 2 houses down, barely out of his teens, and was described by neighbors as quiet, polite and forgettable. At first, officers noted him only as a background detail, a young man who kept his head down and waved when spoken to. The son's wife mentioned him casually during a follow-up interview, referring to him simply as the boy next door. Her tone was dismissive, almost practiced, as if the label itself stripped him of importance. She said he helped carry groceries once, fixed a loose fence board, nothing more. Investigators recorded the statement and moved on, unaware that this was the first deliberate minimization in a growing pattern. It was a neighbor across the street who complicated that narrative. She told police she had seen the young man outside the house late at night, standing close to the wife near the garage, voices low, bodies angled inward. Nothing explicit, she admitted, but enough to linger in memory. Another resident recalled seeing his bike leaned against the side gate more than once, long after the lights inside should have gone out. Detectives returned to the case file and reopened the question. Phone records showed no direct calls, but encrypted messaging apps appeared on both devices, installed within weeks of each other. Deleted data fragments suggested long exchanges that spiked after midnight. The timing overlapped with periods when the husband was away for work, absences previously considered irrelevant. Surveillance footage from a nearby home provided no clear evidence, only brief silhouettes passing under a streetlight, entering the side yard, disappearing from view. Investigators noted how often the boy's movements aligned with the wife's schedule, how chance encounters began to look rehearsed. The picture forming was not of a reckless affair, but of something slower, quieter, and more deliberate. When questioned informally, the young man appeared nervous but cooperative. He described the wife as kind, lonely, someone who listened when no one else did. He insisted nothing inappropriate had happened, yet his language betrayed confusion, emotional dependency he could not fully name. Officers observed the imbalance immediately, the way he deferred, the way responsibility slid away from him in every sentence. By the end of the week, the boy next door was no longer a footnote. He was a presence threaded through timelines and behaviors, a silent axis around which the case subtly turned. And as investigators prepared to examine the messages that no longer existed, it became clear that someone inside the house had known far more than they were saying. The realization shifted the investigation's center of gravity. What had once looked like a private marital fracture now hinted at a wider network of silence and observation. Detectives began reviewing who had access, who listened, and who watched without intervening. The boy was young, impressionable, but he had not acted alone within that space. Attention slowly turned inward, toward the household itself, toward the routines that allowed secrecy to grow undetected. Somewhere between protection and possession, another figure had been tracking every movement. And as officers prepared to confront the family again, they understood the next answers would not come from the neighbor's door, but from inside the home where suspicion had already taken root. That presence, still unnamed, would soon step forward, forcing the investigation into a far more intimate and dangerous phase, one that would expose motives disguised as concern and control mistaken for love within the family walls that finally collapsed during the coming days. By the evening of March 19, 2019, detectives had begun a detailed examination of the digital footprint inside the house. Phones, tablets, and laptops were collected, each device treated as a potential witness. What appeared at first as routine communication quickly transformed into a tangled web of secrets, emotional manipulation, and evidence of growing obsession. Encrypted messages surfaced first. Short, deleted, and often cryptic, they hinted at clandestine meetings and carefully timed encounters. Investigators reconstructed fragments of conversations using digital forensics, piecing together the narrative from the gaps left behind. Each recovered message added a layer of intensity previously unseen by neighbors, family, or even law enforcement. The tone shifted dramatically from casual pleasantries to desperation and dependency. Words like, "I can't stop thinking about you," and "don't tell anyone," appeared repeatedly, paired with timestamps that suggested late-night exchanges. The son's wife's replies revealed internal conflict. She oscillated between fear, guilt, and fascination. Detectives noted patterns of deletion that suggested premeditation. Threads were cleared soon after sending. Images were deleted, only partially recovered. Some messages were sent and then rewritten, as if she were testing her own conscience before committing to her words. One particular series of messages captured the emotional unraveling vividly. Initially flirtatious, they grew urgent, almost pleading. The wife expressed frustration at maintaining appearances, a longing for escape, and a hidden excitement that bordered on recklessness. Investigator Ruiz commented quietly to Cole, "This isn't just a secret relationship. This is obsession. She's caught between fear and desire, and it's escalating fast." The mother-in-law's role became apparent in indirect ways. Some messages referenced near discoveries, almost tauntingly. References to someone watching, someone intervening, began to emerge in the text. The wife knew she was being monitored but continued the exchanges nonetheless, heightening the sense of tension. Cinematic details surfaced in the reconstructed timeline. Messages sent at 11:43 p.m., answered at 12:01 a.m. The brief gaps suggested hurried replies, glances at screens in the dark, whispering into phones. Investigators imagined her pacing, isolated in a living room, aware of the mother-in-law's scrutiny yet compelled to respond. Analysis revealed the neighbor's influence too. His tone shifted from polite curiosity to possessive urgency over time. Instructions became requests, and requests became veiled demands. The power dynamics were clear. He was not merely a friend or helper. He was a catalyst, pushing her toward choices she would later regret. As the investigators documented the exchanges, they noted recurring references to an emotional trap. The wife expressed guilt in one thread, "I feel like I'm betraying him every time I smile at you." In the next, her excitement over planned secret meetings contradicted her remorse. The juxtaposition painted a picture of someone unraveling psychologically. Every deleted thread recovered added to the impression that the relationship had been long planned in secrecy. Each attempt to erase evidence only confirmed the depth of emotional entanglement. By the chapter's close, the son's wife was no longer merely a spouse caught in routine domestic life. She had become someone vulnerable, conflicted, and emotionally exposed. A person whose moral boundaries had begun to blur. The final discovery that evening was a message left unsent, buried in drafts. "If he finds out, it will change everything." That single line crystallized the stakes and foreshadowed the imminent exposure that would drive the investigation forward. Investigators now had a digital roadmap leading directly from secrecy to revelation, pointing toward one inevitable next step: understanding the neighbor's role in this unfolding drama. The threads of conversation demanded confrontation, and the detectives knew the next interviews would peel back the final layers of deception. By the fifth day of investigation, March 22, 2019, detectives returned to the mother-in-law for a more in-depth statement. The preliminary interviews had hinted at her vigilance, but only now did the full extent of her surveillance come to light. She spoke with measured precision, each sentence revealing layers of observation that went far beyond mere parental concern. "I watched her routines for months," she admitted. "When my son was away, I followed her movements, where she went, who she spoke to, what she texted. I never wanted to believe anything was wrong, but instinct told me otherwise." She described checking her daughter-in-law's phone in secret, scanning deleted messages, noting call durations, and even recording fragments of conversations. Each act, she insisted, was meant to protect her son from emotional harm, though the line between concern and intrusion blurred increasingly as she spoke. Detective Cole made notes silently, noting how calmly the mother-in-law recounted actions that might otherwise be considered obsessive. There was no shame in her voice, only a firm conviction that her intervention had been necessary. "She started leaving late at night," the mother-in-law continued, "walking past our house, sometimes meeting someone across the street. I followed her once or twice quietly to see who it could be. That's when I realized, whatever is happening, it's beyond my control." Her description of surveillance was meticulous. Parked cars, lingering shadows, whispered phone conversations, and notes scribbled to track patterns. She had documented the details with photographic precision. "I wasn't spying for myself," she said. "I was trying to preserve the family my son believed in." The officers pressed gently, asking when suspicion turned into certainty. The mother-in-law's eyes darkened, and she paused. "I found a message. A text on her phone that wasn't meant for my son. The words were innocent at first glance, but the intent was clear. I realized then that the trust we had built over the years was already broken. Detective Ruiz noted the way she described discovering the text, a mix of triumph and dread. It was as if she had won the proof of betrayal, yet lost something far more essential. The peace she believed she could maintain. She spoke of overhearing conversations at night, subtle glances exchanged through half-open windows, and patterns of behavior too consistent to be accidental. Each piece formed a mosaic of secrecy, emotional dependence, and a boundary being crossed repeatedly. Her justification was consistent: protection, love, and responsibility. But the implication was clear: the marriage she sought to safeguard had been compromised. The wife's choices, influenced by an external presence, had created a situation beyond repair. By the end of the interview, it was evident that the mother-in-law's vigilance had uncovered the first concrete evidence of betrayal. She had moved from suspicion to proof, and in doing so, she set in motion the next stage of the investigation. Her perspective now dominated the case narrative, and detectives realized that the next step had to involve confronting the young neighbor directly. His role, previously peripheral, was becoming central to understanding the unraveling of the family's carefully maintained facade. March 16, 2019, 11:38 p.m., less than 7 hours before the emergency call would shatter the morning calm. Inside the dimly lit house, shadows clung to the corners like witnesses, stretching over walls that had silently observed tension for months. The son's wife stood by the living room window, her phone clutched tightly, screen glowing faintly against her pale face. The mother-in-law entered silently, carrying an air of quiet authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. The wife flinched, her eyes darting to the floor. "What about?" she whispered, avoiding confrontation but unable to escape it. "You know what?" the mother-in-law replied. "I've seen the messages. I know the meetings. I know everything you've been hiding." The confession hung in the air, a weight too heavy to ignore. For a moment, silence became a character of its own, pressing down on both women. The wife's breathing grew shallow. She turned toward her, voice shaking. I didn't mean for it to happen," she admitted, words tumbling out in fragments. I didn't think it was wrong at first. I didn't realize how far it would go. Please, don't make it worse." The mother-in-law took a slow step closer. "You're already making it worse," she said softly, almost pitying. "You've been crossing lines, betraying my son, and now you're trying to hide it from me too." The wife's head dropped into her hands. "I can't stop thinking about him," she whispered, voice breaking. "I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. He's always there. Always. Everything feels so intense. I didn't plan this. Her words trailed into silence, choked by emotion. The mother-in-law leaned against the doorway, listening, calculating, letting the confession unfold entirely before intervening further. The power dynamics in the room had shifted. Control had moved from the mother-in-law to the one whose guilt and obsession now ruled the moment. "You have no idea what this is doing to my son," the older woman said finally, breaking the tension with a razor-edge calm. "Do you understand? The betrayal, the lies, the secrecy. It's all happening under his roof. And you chose it." "I didn't choose him," the wife murmured, almost defensively. "It just happened. He makes me feel alive, understood. I can't pretend anymore." A long pause followed, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the wall clock. Both women recognized the point of no return. Boundaries had shattered. Authority, morality, and secrecy collided. Nothing would remain the same. "I can't undo what you've done," the mother-in-law said at last, her voice soft but resolute. "I can't fix it, but I can make sure the truth comes out. You need to understand that." The wife looked up, tears streaking her face, realizing in that moment that concealment was over. The raw, unfiltered emotions between them had set a chain in motion. Every word spoken, every hidden act revealed, had brought them here, to the brink of exposure. "Please," the wife pleaded, don't ruin everything for him. I already have." the mother-in-law replied almost regretfully. And we both know it. The confrontation ended not with violence but with a resigned understanding. The wife slumped into a chair, trembling, while the mother-in-law returned to the hallway, silent, deliberate, already preparing the steps that would lead to the morning call. Outside, the night pressed in on the quiet neighborhood, unaware of the emotional storm raging in one unassuming house. Shadows and moonlight played over windows, silently documenting everything by the end of the night. A decision had been made that could not be undone. The wife would be confronted. The son would be shielded or warned. And the truth, long contained, was poised to surface when officers arrived hours later. That night's confrontation would explain the tension in the air, the trembling of the wife, and the unyielding composure of the mother-in-law. It was the night everything shifted, the night the first domino fell, and the investigation would now follow a trail that could not be ignored. By March 18, 2019, police were deeply entrenched in the household investigation. What had begun as a domestic disturbance call had evolved into a labyrinth of conflicting accounts, half-truths, and subtle deception. Officers sifted through statements, timelines, and physical evidence, searching for coherence where there was none. The first discrepancies appeared in the timeline. The son's wife claimed she was alone at home during late-night hours, but security cameras from neighboring homes suggested otherwise. Small details, lights switching on, doors opening, contradicted her account. Officers marked each inconsistency, knowing that every deviation hinted at hidden truths. The mother-in-law's own account was precise but selective. She admitted to following her daughter-in-law, checking phones, and documenting suspicious behaviors. Yet even she omitted certain observations, protecting some information, as if shielding one person while quietly condemning another. Loyalty and moral judgment intermingled in her choices, creating a web in which truth was only partially visible. Detectives began to recognize patterns of emotional manipulation. The son's wife had cultivated secrecy, not only with the neighbor but within the household itself. Subtle lies, omissions, and carefully timed absences suggested premeditation. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law had turned observation into a strategic tool, controlling what evidence surfaced and what remained hidden. One crucial discovery involved a notebook found in the wife's bedroom. Pages filled with dates, initials, and cryptic phrases documented clandestine meetings. At first glance, it seemed personal, almost harmless, but the layering of code-like references suggested an awareness of scrutiny. She had planned, tracked, and adjusted her behavior to avoid detection, while manipulating emotional responses within the household. The detectives noted a growing psychological pattern. Manipulation had become a method of survival. Each person's loyalty was weaponized, protecting some relationships while allowing others to fracture. Blood ties did not guarantee trust. Family bonds were wielded as shields and swords alike. Conversations between the mother-in-law and investigators revealed her dual role. She acted as both guardian and judge. "I wanted to protect my son, but I also knew what she was capable of hiding," she admitted. Her voice remained steady, but the implications of her surveillance were clear. She was shaping the investigation even before police were fully aware. By afternoon, the officers realized the cost of betrayal was tangible. Emotional fatigue, fear, and tension had seeped into every corner of the household. Even the air seemed heavy with unsaid words and unrecorded encounters. The once orderly home now resembled a stage for psychological warfare, where each participant measured risk, loyalty, and advantage. Small details revealed themselves as powerful signals. A misplaced cup, a text screenshot left open on a tablet, a hastily deleted call log. All indicated calculated concealment. Manipulation had moved beyond intent. It had become strategy, a weapon deployed to control perception and outcomes. As the day ended, detectives confronted the realization that truth was layered, partial, and fragile. The mother-in-law's interventions, the wife's secrecy, and the neighbor's influence had created a network of loyalty and deception that complicated judgment. Blood was thick, but so was betrayal, and sometimes the two could not coexist. March 20, 2019, 2:15 p.m. Detectives finally summoned the 20-year-old neighbor to the station for questioning. At first glance, he seemed almost inconsequential. polite, soft-spoken, neatly dressed. Yet beneath that exterior, investigators sensed a fragile tension, a nervous energy that hinted at the deeper chaos he had helped shape. He sat across from Detective Ruiz, hands trembling slightly, eyes avoiding direct contact. The mother-in-law's revelations had already painted a picture of secrecy and manipulation, but hearing from the young man himself brought a new, unsettling clarity. "Why were you involved with her?" Ruiz asked, voice calm but firm. The neighbor hesitated, swallowing hard. I didn't know it was wrong at first," he stammered. "She made me feel important, special. I didn't understand what I was getting into. I just followed her." Detective Cole leaned forward, noting the hesitation, the quick glances at the floor, the way his hands fidgeted with a pen. "You realize the consequences? She's married, this is a family. Do you understand how serious this is?" "Yes," he whispered. "I do now. But I wasn't in control either. I thought I was, but she guided everything, told me when to come, when to leave, made me feel like I was part of something. Secret, powerful in a way, and I was scared. Scared if I said no, she would leave or get angry. Or maybe worse." His testimony revealed emotional grooming in subtle, devastating detail. He described how her attention validated him, how small gestures, text messages, secret smiles, whispered words, ensnared him in a dynamic he didn't fully comprehend. Fear and fascination coexisted, entwined so tightly that the line between love and manipulation blurred. Detectives documented everything. Late-night conversations, hidden messages, carefully timed encounters. All evidence of a power imbalance that was undeniable. Though he was older than a child, the psychological control exerted by the wife over him created an uneven relationship, leaving him vulnerable to her influence and decisions. "She told me what to think, how to act," he admitted quietly. "I thought it was mutual, but looking back, I wasn't deciding anything. She was." The officers pressed for specifics. Meetings, phone calls, even fleeting touches that escalated tension. Each answer revealed layers of secrecy and complicity. The neighbor's voice grew softer as he spoke, almost as if admitting each detail physically drained him. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought it was just us. But it wasn't. I see that now." For investigators, the testimony reframed the entire relationship. The wife was no longer just a passive participant. She had orchestrated emotional control, drawing the young man into a complex web of dependency. Fear, love, and guilt had been leveraged with subtle precision. The neighbor's account also clarified previously ambiguous details from phone records, deleted messages, and late-night encounters. His presence explained the patterns of secrecy, the careful planning, and the emotional intensity that had dominated the household. By the end of the interview, both detectives understood the magnitude of what they had uncovered. This was not a simple case of infidelity or youthful indiscretion. It was a collision of adult authority and youthful vulnerability, moral compromise and psychological manipulation. By March 21, 2019, investigators had shifted their focus from statements and testimonies to the silent witnesses within the house itself. Forensic teams meticulously documented every detail. Fingerprints, smudges, marks on walls, and stains on carpet fibers. Each object seemed to carry a story the occupants had not intended to tell. The dining room, once the setting for polite breakfasts and routine conversations, revealed subtle evidence of struggle. A chair was slightly scuffed at its legs. A glass had a faint lipstick mark not matching the wife's usual shade, and a doorknob bore scratches consistent with repeated, desperate gripping. Each observation contradicted the narratives provided by the family and the living room. Investigators noted disturbed floorboards and a faint trail of debris leading from one doorway to another. It suggested movement during heightened stress, perhaps even confrontation. While no violent act had been officially reported, the house bore the echoes of emotional tension so intense that physical traces had manifested without overt conflict. The kitchen counter contained subtle yet telling remnants. Crumbs arranged as if hastily consumed, a coffee cup moved repeatedly from its coaster, fingerprints overlapping with smudges that did not belong to the mother-in-law or the wife. The forensic team cataloged each trace, building a chronology that challenged verbal accounts. Upstairs, the bedroom revealed the most compelling contradictions. Bedding was disheveled in ways inconsistent with casual sleep. A window latch had been forced slightly open, suggesting covert exits. Clothing was folded and then disturbed again, indicating hurried movement. The mother-in-law's vigilance had missed nothing, yet even her scrutiny could not erase the physical evidence the house retained. Investigators began cross-referencing marks with phone timestamps, messages, and statements. The dissonance was stark. Where the wife claimed solitude, objects suggested the presence of another, aligning with the neighbor's testimony and further exposing the hidden patterns of secrecy and manipulation. The house, in a sense, became a character itself, silent but accusatory. Every surface, every mark, and every subtle imperfection testified to the emotional turbulence that had unfolded. It remembered more than the people inside were willing to admit. As detectives walked from room to room, they noticed psychological fractures surfacing among those involved. The wife appeared haunted, retreating into corners during questioning, often staring at walls as if the house itself were judging her. The mother-in-law, usually composed, grew rigid, her movements measured but heavy with unspoken frustration. Even the officers felt the oppressive weight of the environment. By evening, it was clear that the family's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. The consistency of lies, half-truths, and omissions clashed violently with the physical evidence. The more they tried to justify actions verbally, the more the house contradicted them silently, with precision that no human account could match. In interviews later that day, both women began to show signs of psychological breakdown. Words faltered, voices wavered, and recollections became fragmented. The house's testimony had forced confrontation with truths they were not ready to face. By the end of the day, investigators understood that the next phase could no longer rely solely on statements. They would need to reconstruct actions, timelines, and motives based on tangible evidence. The objects, the stains, and the subtle traces that had borne witness to the unfolding betrayal. March 23, 2019, 10:05 a.m. The mother-in-law sat in the interrogation room, facing officers and the weight of her own decisions. What had begun as a call for help had evolved into a maelstrom, and now her role was fully revealed. Every surveillance measure, every hidden observation, every intervention she had executed was documented and scrutinized. Detective Cole summarized her actions aloud. Following the daughter-in-law, intercepting messages, documenting clandestine meetings, and ultimately reporting suspicions to authorities. The mother-in-law listened quietly, her expression calm, almost detached, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of fatigue and tension. "I did what I had to do," she said finally, her voice steady but unwavering. "My son deserved the truth. The family deserved honesty. I couldn't let deception continue unchecked." Officers paused, noting the moral complexity. Her actions had triggered the investigation that unveiled the secret relationship, yet they also raised questions. Had she acted out of maternal protection, or had revenge and control motivated her methods? Lines blurred as detectives weighed the necessity of exposure against the invasive tactics she had employed. The emotional fallout was immediate and overwhelming. The daughter-in-law, confronted with the mother-in-law's revelations, broke down entirely. Tears, sobs, and guilt poured out as she admitted the depth of her involvement with the neighbor, the secrecy she had maintained, and the betrayal of the family she had ostensibly vowed to honor. Even the officers felt the intensity. The mother-in-law's intervention had fractured the household psychologically, revealing not only infidelity but the consequences of surveillance, manipulation, and secrecy. Loyalties had shifted, trust had been eroded, and the emotional cost was undeniable. Neighbors were now aware that the incident had escalated beyond domestic disagreement. Whispers, speculation, and fear spread quietly along the suburban streets. The ripple effect of the mother-in-law's actions extended outward, affecting everyone connected to the household. Her justification persisted. "I didn't enjoy it. I didn't act out of malice. But sometimes, the only way to protect someone is to confront the truth, even if it hurts." Detectives noted the duality in her perspective. Protector and accuser, moral guardian and manipulator. Every statement revealed the intricate balance she had maintained between intervention and control. She had exposed her daughter-in-law's betrayal, but in doing so, she had also exposed her own decisions to moral and ethical scrutiny. The daughter-in-law, fragile and trembling, acknowledged that concealment had become unbearable. I never meant to hurt anyone," she whispered. "But I couldn't stop. And now it's all out in the open." For the investigators, the sequence of exposure was now clear. The mother-in-law had acted as catalyst, turning suspicion into evidence, and secrecy into confession. The consequences were irreversible. Every character involved was now entangled in the fallout, unable to retreat into denial or avoidance. April 15, 2019, 9 a.m. The courtroom in Riverside County was quiet, the kind of heavy silence that presses down on every surface, filled with anticipation, judgment, and unspoken fear. Lawyers shuffled papers, officers prepared statements, and family members sat rigid, eyes fixed on the proceedings. The weight of weeks of investigation now crystallized in testimony. The mother-in-law took the stand first. Calm and deliberate, she recounted her observations, her surveillance, and the discovery of her son's wife's secret relationship. Each word was measured, each pause intentional. The courtroom listened as she described the emotional betrayal she had witnessed, and the measures she had taken to expose it. "I acted out of duty," she told the judge, voice unwavering. "I had to protect my son. I had to reveal the truth before it destroyed him completely. I never sought to punish, only to prevent further harm." Cross-examination tested her resolve. The defense probed her methods, checking phones, following the daughter-in-law, listening behind doors. Was this protection or intrusion? Was this justice or revenge cloaked as morality? Every question dug into her motives, revealing the complexity of human intention. The daughter-in-law followed with her testimony. Shaken, her voice trembled as she described emotional entanglement with the 20-year-old neighbor. She spoke of secrecy, fear, and longing, of feeling trapped between desire and guilt. Her confession was vivid, almost cinematic, painting a portrait of someone caught in a web of manipulation that blurred the lines between choice and coercion. "I never intended for it to reach this point," she admitted. "But I couldn't stop. I couldn't escape the intensity of what I felt. And now, the truth is here, and there's no undoing it." The neighbor was called last. His voice was hesitant, conflicted, and fragile. He admitted involvement, acknowledged emotional influence, and described the power imbalance that had defined their relationship. Each word added a layer of accountability, highlighting the psychological complexity that had allowed secrecy and manipulation to thrive. Throughout the proceedings, the courtroom absorbed the cost of knowing. Every participant felt it. The mother-in-law's vigilance, the wife's betrayal, the neighbor's vulnerability. Witnesses described fractured trust, emotional trauma, and the permanence of exposure. The evidence was indisputable. Phone records, messages, forensic notes from the house, and personal testimony all aligned to reveal the sequence of events. Lies could no longer obscure reality. The truth carried consequences heavier than any falsehood, and no one emerged unscathed. When the verdict was delivered, it closed the legal chapter of the case. Responsibilities were assigned, accountability established, and justice formalized in black and white. Yet emotionally, nothing was resolved. The family remained fractured. Trust had been shattered. Relationships could not simply be repaired with a legal decision. Detectors of the court observed subtle tremors. A mother-in-law rigid in her protective stance, a wife haunted by shame and guilt, a young neighbor aware that innocence had been lost. The psychological cost was immediate and tangible. By the end of the day, everyone involved understood that the courtroom could address legality, but not morality, not grief, not the irreversible effects of exposure. The cost of knowing, the burden of truth, had permanently altered lives. May 2, 2019, late afternoon. The house stood quiet, almost inert, as if it were mourning the lives that had unfolded within its walls. Curtains hung unchanged, furniture remained in place, yet an invisible weight settled over every room. The echoes of argument, whispers, and confessions had faded, leaving only silence. A silence heavier than any sound. The mother-in-law no longer paced hallways, no longer monitored movements, no longer documented every subtle shift in behavior. She had fulfilled her purpose, though at a cost she did not fully measure. The family she had sought to protect was no longer recognizable. Trust had eroded, and relationships had fractured beyond repair. The daughter-in-law moved through the house with quiet resignation. Her expressions of fear, guilt, and longing had been replaced by a stillness that hinted at exhaustion, both emotional and moral. She occupied the same spaces, but her presence carried no intimacy, no warmth. The routines remained, yet they were hollow, performed by habit rather than connection. The young neighbor had retreated, removed from the environment he had once navigated with naivety and desire. His youthful presence, once disruptive and intense, had been silenced by exposure, by understanding the consequences of his actions. The emotional fallout reached him, even in absence, leaving a lingering awareness of culpability and loss. Detectives and neighbors alike observed the house from the outside, noting the absence of vibrancy that had once marked domestic life. No laughter, no chatter, no subtle glances betrayed connection. Even the familiar hum of ordinary living seemed muted. The home remembered everything, but the people who had animated it had been changed irrevocably. In reflection, the mother-in-law recognized the true cost of her interventions. Protection had required intrusion, vigilance had demanded obsession, and revelation had necessitated confrontation. The lines between justice and revenge, care and control, had been blurred so thoroughly that she could not separate her intentions from their consequences. The daughter-in-law acknowledged her own responsibility quietly, privately, aware that secrecy and deception had begun the chain of events long before legal judgments or confrontations. She understood that betrayal is rarely born of crime alone. It is born of ignored boundaries, unchecked desires, and manipulations that escalate in silence. The narrator steps in here, solemn and measured, reflecting on the permanence of what has occurred. Betrayal, emotional manipulation, and moral compromise leave marks no verdict or confession can erase. Lives are altered, trust shattered, and what remains is the stark awareness of choices made in secrecy. By the time night fell, the house was still, its walls holding on to the memories of arguments, whispers, confessions, and hidden acts. Outside, the neighborhood resumed normal rhythms, unaware of the profound upheaval that had taken place just behind closed doors. The story closes with a final, sobering reminder. Vigilance, honesty, and respect for boundaries are the only defenses against betrayal. Secrets, control, and manipulation, however subtle, can unravel families, destroy trust, and leave lives forever altered. The silence that now fills the house is not peace. It is the echo of consequences that no one can undo. In that quiet, the lesson remains. Betrayal does not begin with crime. It begins with the small choices that erode trust, the hidden manipulations that grow unchecked, and the ignored warnings that signal what is already slipping away. This case stands as a reminder that crime often grows quietly inside homes, disguised as love, loyalty, or protection. When power replaces trust and secrecy replaces honesty, the cost is never private. It is permanent. Vigilance, accountability, and moral courage remain the only safeguards against irreversible loss.